Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for October 3rd, 2022. For those of you who don't know, this is known as German Unity Day in Germany, the Tag der Deutschen Einheit, the day commemorating the reunification on October 3rd, 1990. This came at the end of the Cold War, and unfortunately, it was the beginning of the Unipolar Era. The idea that the West has won the Cold War and has the right to impose its model on the rest of the world. There were negotiations with Russia that ended up with a peaceful agreement that the Russians would withdraw from East Germany, would eventually dismantle the Warsaw Pact, but the West promised that in return there would be no eastward expansion of NATO. That promise was broken and has been broken at least 6 times in the last 30 years as NATO has moved further and further toward the Russian border. Now, what is the Unipolar Era? In the US, it was based on the idea that we've reached the end of history, that the neoliberal economic model has triumphed, that the Soviet model, the socialist model, any other model have been discredited, and that the world must now adjust itself to acceptance of this idea of a unipolar order, which essentially has increasingly oriented toward a world of anti-sovereignty, where sovereign nation states give up their rights to be accepted in an order controlled from the top by an integrated collection of corporate cartels. This has been pushed further ahead with the idea of the Great Reset and the Green New Deal, where no other model of economic development except the neoliberal model is accepted. And the attempt to impose this by international treaty and to enforce it by arms is what characterizes our situation today. This is what Liz Truss meant in her UN General Assembly address when she spoke about an economic NATO. That is, the economic policies would be imposed, if necessary, by military force. And this is what the Russians are calling the Euro-Atlantic model. Now, in fact, this transatlantic model is collapsing. We see it in the overall collapse of nations of Europe, the economic crisis hitting the United States, and the imposition of brutal austerity in the developing sector. So instead of a peaceful transition to a new era of cooperation for mutual development, what we've seen is an era of regime change, of coups, of wars, and now increasingly censorship of a dialogue to move away from this order. So let me just say that today in Germany, while the celebration is of German unity, we're seeing increasing disunity in opposition to the existing government as we're facing a cold, dark winter here. Now, this is especially true throughout the European Union, for example, in the United Kingdom, where you have a descent into hell, the imposition of the harshest form of neoliberal economic policy, austerity for the vast majority of the population. And who benefits? The creators of this idea of the unipolar order, namely the City of London and the financial and corporate interests that are running the city. Now, this week we're seeing an escalation of what might be called a transition. That is a move of whole sections of the world away from the unipolar order. This is something which we're not hearing about much in the West because we're facing a controlled press which is trying to present the idea that Russia and China are eternal enemies, are threats to our continued existence. There's no debate that's allowed. In fact, there was an extremely important address given by Putin on Saturday, which was not heard in the West, which was essentially rejected as Putin being a beast, a barbarian, a war hawk, preparing for nuclear war, and so on. Now, the Russian view, which was expressed by Putin, is that we've reached the end of the unipolar order, the order of neoliberalism, of neo-imperialism, and of neo-colonialism. We've reached the end. And the idea is that Russia is emerging as a defender of the global South. Now, let me just give you some further insight into what's going on in the North, which was based on a presentation given by the Canadian Foreign Minister Joly, who spoke about how Russian disinformation is feeding anti-Americanism, especially in Latin America. And what she said is that it's the Russian disinformation which is causing a rejection of American hegemony in Latin America. Now, has she never heard the term gringo? Is she unaware of the disastrous effects of imposition of American shock therapy policy on Latin American countries? The International Monetary Fund hit teams that have gone in and pulled the rug out from development policies and forced governments to come hat in hand begging for pennies for debt reorganization from the West. The actual policy of the debt trap has been the policy of the International Monetary Fund for decades. So the idea that there's anti-Americanism because of Russian propaganda is complete lunacy, but it shows the degree to which leaders such as this Canadian foreign minister believe their own hype. Now, I want to give you very briefly some elements of the Russian view. And it's contained in an essay by Sergei Karaganov, who is a Russian intellectual and a spokesman for what you might call the new realism in Russia. And his essay is titled From the Non-West to the World Majority. I'm presenting this to you because you're not going to hear this in the Western media or from Western political leaders. What he said is that and this reflects a growing consensus in Russia, is that Russia is moving away from Euro-Atlantic civilization in its present form. And he said this is because the Euro-Atlantic region itself is rapidly degrading. He said it's driven by endless growth of consumption, the financialization of all industries, and the elimination of borders between the real and the virtual. And he said at the same time, it's terrified of the, quote, rise of the non-West, unquote. And he said the Western establishment is committed to stop this realignment, which is underway. And to do it, they need an enemy image to unite the West and maintain power despite the failures of their system, which he said is now crumbling. And he said that for there to be peace, the West must reject this neoliberal system, which is collapsing, and move into a real dialogue. But he said, in the meantime, it's not going to stop Russia and its allies from building an alternative system. Now, to dismiss this is to reject reality. And what's the reality? Well, look what happened last week with the blowing up of the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines. The attempt to blame Russia for doing this is completely absurd. NATO General Secretary Stoltenberg was on the television shows on Sunday morning promising a stern response once the guilty party is determined. I think most people in the world know that Russia didn't do it. And the suspicion is mostly directed toward the United States because of some ill-timed statements back in February by Joe Biden. But there are several countries in NATO which could have been responsible, but they're going to try to blame Russia. But a leading Swiss intelligence and military expert named Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Bossard said that Stoltenberg's statement is like the thief yelling, "Stop thief." Now, even Henry Kissinger, who's not someone that I quote with any great admiration. I mean, Kissinger was one of the leading enemies of Lyndon LaRouche throughout Lyndon LaRouche's life. Kissinger once called for nuclear strikes against the Soviet Union. But he warned in a speech on September 30th, we are now at the edge of war with Russia and China, on issues which we partly created. And one of the things he emphasizes, Ukraine must not be brought into NATO. Now, a sign of how far Western leadership has degenerated is that Henry Kissinger now comes across almost as the voice of reason. Now, in this situation, it's time for the people of the Western world, Europe and the United States, Canada, and so on, Australia, New Zealand, to reject the unipolar order, to reject the imposition of an Anglo-American, neoliberal, neoconservative world in which Western elites impose a model which is collapsing on the rest of the world, which is striving for economic development and which is unifying as part of the global South behind the leadership of Russia and China. You may not like Russia and China, but they are offering the possibility of a new system which is not based on the funny money controlled by Wall Street and the City of London. The Schiller Institute and the LaRouche Organization and the Executive Intelligence Review will be holding a series of events this week, which will be designed to mobilize the population of the West away from the war hawk push for defense of a collapsing order. Keep tuned to our website. We're going to be continuing to provide a view of the world which you're not going to find in any Western publication, which is committed to a defense of an order which is crumbling and collapsing. So stay with us, and I'll see you again tomorrow.